At Hierakonpolis, we find necropoli, and a necropolis is simply a city of the dead, or a cemetery. But what's interesting at Hierakonpolis is we actually see two tomb styles emerge. And the size of them and the content reflect both social power and prestige of the individual itself. So Tomb 1, this down here, is actually the style tombs that we've generally only found prior to this in Lower Egypt. So they're constructed in a wadi, and again, that's a dry creek or stream bed. They're mud brick lined tombs, and there was a structure built over the top of wood and then reed, and these were painted, surrounded by a low reed fence. So you can kind of see that reconstruction right here. And we often find group burials. So it could be that all court members were being buried together. It could be all family members being buried together. Now, Tomb 2 is the style of Upper Egypt. And what's kind of interesting is that all of the Tomb 1s, the Lower Egypt styles, are downstream from the Upper Egypt style tombs, just like they would be or have originally been spread out on the Nile itself. So these are tombs that are cut right into the bedrock. They're usually long, narrow trenches with a little L-shaped hole cut in the center. So not quite as maybe sophisticated, I guess is the word to think of, but in the various burials we do find pottery, we find baskets, we find flint projectile points, again some reed arrow shafts, which I showed you in the previous slide, leather ropes, papyrus, all different kinds of goods. Again, the amount of goods changes from burial to burial, indications of social status. We often find that these tombs are surrounded by animal burials, and they can be dogs, they can be goats, we find cattle, sheep, elephant, crocodile, baboons, and hippos. So some are mummified, some are not. Probably some type of ceremonial thing going on here. Some archaeologists working in the area suggest that these are indication of nomes. And a nome is kind of like a geographical province. Some of these do show up in the Narmer tablet, which we're going to talk about next, but they're usually associated with maybe villages and things like that. Some people have suggested, because we find both of these tomb styles here, both the Lower and the Upper Egypt styles, that these burials at Hierakonpolis represent the unification of Egypt. Further evidence for that comes on the Narmer tablet. So this is dated to around 5,100 years ago. It was discovered in 1898. It's a very thin sheet of stone, and it is engraved with different kinds of symbols and figures. So this kind of primary individual here, based on the hieroglyphs, which is a fish and a chisel, pronounced Narmer, seems to be, of course, the most important person in this particular graphic. The whole Narmer tablet itself has been used, or has been interpreted as King Narmer here, unifying Egypt under the god hawk Horus, who you can see right here. On one side, Narmer is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, so a native of Hierakonpolis, so to speak. But on the other side, he's wearing a combination of the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt. So again, more signs of unification. And from this point on, the leader always wears the combined crown. So why unification at this point in time? Well, around 5,500 years ago, we start to see desert encroachment into the grasslands. So that area around the Nile is becoming even more circumscripted. So leaders were probably emerging to help develop irrigation projects. And by that, probably began to profit from agricultural surplus. And the old axiom about absolute power can maybe be applied here, but we do start to see, again, important individuals emerge until we find Narmer, who then becomes known as King Menes, as the ruler of all of Egypt. So this brings us to the dynastic period. So Narmer, or King Menes, is the first pharaoh. We see this period began again at 5,100 years ago when Narmer conquers Lower Egypt. He moves the capital up to Memphis. So from here, Conpolis, up to Memphis, which is kind of a more logical junction of Lower and Upper Egypt, easier to get to both places relatively quickly. The unification of Egypt didn't occur overnight. It actually took a couple centuries, but by 4900 BP, it's a completely or complexly organized state. So Pharaoh, again, is the head of the state, also the head of the state religion, and is considered divine. Pharaoh was the mediator between God and people. He was responsible for ensuring that the Nile flooded every year. Everybody in the Egyptian state worked for Pharaoh, and they were paid in food based on all the evidence that we have. And we see quite a bit of uniform pottery again, utilitarian bowls, all the same size, somewhat like we saw in Mesopotamia, and that's probably how they were measuring out grain to pay the different workers. But everybody got paid. Everybody did different kinds of jobs. A lot of people did construction. Some people did military. But again, everybody got paid. To kind of run this state, a complex bureaucracy emerged. So you have Pharaoh, and then we have the vizier, who's kind of like a chief executive, generally a royal relative. Then we have priests, the chancellor of the god, who did special tasks for the king, like went on trading trips. And then we have the provincial government. And those were the nomes, probably, and then the peasants. So again, quite a complex bureaucracy and social organization here. Not all pharaohs were men. There were a few female pharaohs. The first one here is Hatshepsut, and she was the guardian of Ramses I. But just not too many women pharaohs, but there were a few. Now, the pyramids in Egypt are kind of interesting. There are several different types, and we can actually trace the evolution. We're going to look at that in just a second. But this, is one of the things that the Egyptian state is known for, this monumental architecture in the form of pyramids. These are the first, super large-scale stone buildings. They're larger than the ziggurats that we saw in Mesopotamia. So this is kind of indications of economic power and administrative organization, because it does take a lot of planning organization to get this thing built. So the first pyramid in Egypt is the Step Pyramid of Zoser. And this is in the site of Saqqara, which is across the river from Memphis. And it's actually the tomb of King Zoser. It was designed by Imhotep, so he's the architect. Later he becomes deified, and that name might sound familiar to you if you've seen the first two mummy movies. The pyramid at Zoser is actually part of a complex, so there's a stone wall around the pyramid itself. And then there's the Step Pyramid. And there are at least 10 kings buried here. So even though Zoser is the primary interment, others were buried there also. This particular Step Pyramid, this first